Here in Washington, D.C., at the headquarters of the AFL-CIO, AFL-CIO President George Meany and National COPE Director Al Barkin discuss the coming elections. The challenges and the stakes, they agree, make 1970 the big one.
President Meany, in the audience watching this film are the people who will be responsible for the COPE fieldwork in the 1970 election. I know they have two questions uppermost in their mind on which they would like your views. How do we win, and how crucial are this year's elections?
Well, first of all, there is no simple solution, no magic formula for winning elections. The answer is simply hard work. Now, the people who did the COPE job in 1968 know that, Al. That's how we built our unions, and that's how Labor was successful in the last presidential election. It's worth taking a look at what happened in that election. Remember all the news predictions that we were beaten, that our members had deserted us for George Wallace. Well, COPE recruited over 72,000 pre-election workers and added 4.6 million voters to the registration rolls on Election Day. Nearly 100,000 trade unions were mobilized in a massive get-out-the-vote drive that came within a hairbreadth of electing Hubert Humphrey. Through the specialized use of campaign material and literature, amounting to millions of pieces, the Wallace appeal was blunted. COPE did a tremendous job against overwhelming odds, with little or no outside help, and kept the Congress from going conservative. So I don't have to tell the men and women who led that effort in the field that there is no substitute for hard work when it comes to winning elections.
Labor unions kept the Democrats and Republicans from attacking the Keynesian system. It wasn't just the fact that George Meany could turn millions of people out to vote. He could also throw big money into political campaigns through the use of political action committees, also known as PACs. Candidates needed to get their faces on television if they wanted to get votes. They did this by buying advertising, which was becoming more expensive as TV made its way into more homes. Politicians needed money, so they turned to PACs. PACs allowed organizations like labor unions to pool their money together and give it to politicians who made them the best promises. By the end of the 1960s, the biggest PACs were funded by unions, and they firmly backed the Democratic Party. The Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971 changed everything. It limited the amount of money each PAC could give to candidates. Unions were forced to break their giant PACs into several smaller PACs. The number of PACs quadrupled from 248 in 1974 to 1,100 in 1978. But not all of those PACs were associated with unions. The fastest growing sector of PACs were funded by corporations. Between 1968 and 1978, corporations with offices in Washington, D.C. increased from 100 to 500. They weren't there to run factories, they were there to lobby. Lobbying is when a union, a corporation, or any type of organization pressures elected politicians to support their preferred policies. In 1968, GM only had 3 lobbyists in Washington, D.C. By 1978, they had 28. Corporations became the biggest funders of PACs and the biggest lobbyists in Washington. They became bolder and stronger than the unions themselves. Of course, not all corporations are the same. They all want different things and might even be in direct competition with each other. To overcome this issue, 2 of the biggest corporations, Alcoa and General Electric, founded the Business Roundtable in 1972. It was an organization designed to unite corporate interests. They would create reforms they could all agree on and then market those reforms to DC politicians and the country at large. This was a remarkable movement in American history, which is full of examples of rich people trying to prevent class warfare, of poor people uniting with each other to put rich people's heads in guillotines. With the creation of the Business Roundtable, along with corporate PACs and corporate lobbyists, it was the rich people who were uniting. Class warfare was now coming from the top. By 1976, Business Week called the Round Table business's most powerful lobby group in Washington. It was indeed a watershed year. Watergate had ruined the Republican brand. Gerald Ford had taken Nixon's place and faced an impossible election that year. Democrats were in control of Congress. These Democrats weren't the old Hubert Humphrey labor darlings of the 60s. They were the McGovern liberals of 1972, people who prioritized civil rights over labor rights. Most importantly for the Round Table, they were much more willing to take corporate PAC money and entertain corporate lobbyists than previous Democrats. Factories had been moving operations to the Sun Belt, where unions were weaker. The most competitive industries, like clothing, were already starting to move jobs into foreign countries like Mexico altogether, where labor was dirt cheap. Unions were losing members. Businesses fired workers who participated in union activity, which was illegal. When they inevitably got sued, they turned to business roundtable lawyers, who usually won their cases. The number of workers in unions steadily declined as a result. The 70s is often referred to as the me decade. Without the security of an expanding economy or middle-class jobs, it was impossible to plan for the future. People turned to satisfying the most immediate pursuits with drugs and sex. Times Square in New York City during the 1970s was known as a place where you can get both. A few blocks away, at Grand Central Station, the Commodore Hotel sat abandoned, becoming an eyesore in the center of Manhattan. To revitalize the area, the city sold the land to a real estate developer named Donald Trump for $1. He promised to build a posh new hotel in the area in exchange for tax breaks. This was a new strategy for New York City. The city had always been a bastion of Keynesianism, spending on generous social services and welfare programs to lift people out of poverty. In many ways, the city was the center of America's huge economic boom after World War II. When a blackout struck the city in 1965, people had to be evacuated out of elevators and subway tunnels. But everything remained peaceful. A population that was prospering and being taken care of had no reason to panic or riot. But by the mid-1970s, the city was broke. They couldn't spend their way out of their problems this time, so they turned to businessmen like Donald Trump for solutions. When another blackout struck the city in 1977, an orgy of rioting and violence ensued. A population that was poor and desperate had every reason to loot, since they could use or sell whatever they stole. The city had become substantially less white between 1965 and 1977, so it was easy for the media and politicians to blame the looting on some sort of criminality inherent in brown people. The reality is that the city had stopped taking care of its people. It had defunded its schools, hospitals, and social programs. Union jobs left the city. People weren't being taken care of anymore. And I don't think this was a coincidence that this all happened just as the city was becoming less white. As soon as it came time for women and people of color to participate in the same economy in which white males had thrived for over 20 years, the country decided it wanted to change the rules. And, surprise, surprise, those new rules just so happened to leave women and people of color out in the cold. In 1976, the Trumps of the world were seen as saviors. It was no coincidence that that was the year Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize for Economics. Friedman had always been a kind of renegade in the economics world. At a time when every orthodox economist was a Keynesian, Friedman was the opposite. Instead of relying on government spending to pull countries out of financial trouble, Friedman believed in unleashing the power of business to do whatever it wanted. They should be taxed less. They should be subject to fewer regulations. They should be free from the constraints of union agreements.
The operation of the free market is so essential, not only to promote productive efficiency, but even more, to foster harmony and peace among the peoples of the world.
The Business Roundtable, Donald Trump, and Milton Friedman all pointed to the direction America was headed. The era of big labor was dying. The era of big business was on the horizon. The election of 1976 featured two candidates who were not up to the task of responding to these changes. Gerald Ford was dull and uninspiring. Despite being the sitting president, he barely won the Republican nomination after beating off a revolt from California Governor Ronald Reagan in the primaries. Reagan was a mixture of Richard Nixon and Milton Friedman. Someone who promised to marry the culture war of working-class whites to the class war of the Business Roundtable. He lost the 1976 primary, but he'd be back in 1980. The Democrats chose someone equally not up to the task, the governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter. Carter won the nomination because he wasn't a creature of Washington, D.C. He wasn't associated with the stink of Watergate. He was a small business owner, a peanut farmer, so he avoided the simplistic macroeconomic solutions of Keynesianism. Most importantly, he was a Southerner, someone who maybe could bring the Southern states back into the Democratic Party. And that he did, defeating Gerald Ford in the general election. As we saw, upon becoming president, Nixon told his staff to start thinking politically instead of running things well. Carter was the opposite. He wanted to run things well instead of thinking politically. When the country entered a recession, he avoided the old democratic solutions of government spending. He avoided Keynesianism. In fact, he cut government spending. He cut taxes on the wealthy. He lessened the regulations that businesses had to follow. Despite being a Democrat, one union leader called him the best Republican president since Herbert Hoover. This doesn't mean that there weren't Democrats who wanted to breathe life back into Keynesianism. The Democrats in Congress came close to passing a law known as the Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment Act. It was a law that would guarantee a job to every American, no matter their race or gender. It promised to build a working class that cut across racial lines, one that can join unions and provide passports to a middle-class life. The bill got watered down as it made its way through Congress. Carter never threw his weight behind it. It died before it even saw the light of day. The Humphrey-Hawkins bill was the last hope for Keynesianism, the last gasp of the New Deal. Nothing like it has ever come close to being passed ever since. Meanwhile, stagflation nagged throughout Carter's presidency. Another oil crisis led to long lines at the gas station and contributed to rampant inflation. In July of 1979, President Carter gave a televised speech where he said the country was having a crisis of confidence.
It's clear that the true problems of our nation are much deeper than gasoline lines or energy shortages, deeper even than inflation or recession. So I want to speak to you first tonight about a subject even more serious than energy or inflation. I want to talk to you right now about a fundamental threat to American democracy. The threat is nearly invisible in ordinary ways. It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation.
People didn't trust their leaders anymore. The old solutions of Keynesianism didn't work anymore. He encouraged Americans to consume less, expect less, and contribute more to the country. While it did give him a temporary boost in popularity, people look back on the speech now as a low point. Here was the President of the United States, not promising bold action to address the problems of the day, but rather asking them to take the bold action. It's sometimes referred to as his malaise speech, although he never used the word malaise. And malaise described the mood of the country by the end of his first term. But things were about to get much worse. In that same year, one of America's staunchest allies in the Middle East, the Shah of Iran, was overthrown by a Shia Muslim fundamentalist movement. The Shah fled to the United States. The new Iranian government demanded he be sent back for trial. When Carter refused, Iranian students kidnapped American Foreign Service workers and held them hostage. Carter tried to rescue them and failed. The nightly news covered the story incessantly. The longer the hostage languished in prison, the weaker Carter looked. His failure to bring them home was an embarrassment to the United States. Another example of America's declining power 4 short years after losing the Vietnam War. As the hostages languished in Iran, Carter was facing re-election. His opponent would be Ronald Reagan, who had built quite a movement around himself throughout the last half of the 1970s. He had the blessing of the Business Roundtable. As a former actor, he had a gift for selling tax cuts for the rich and reduced government spending as good things to the American people. But he also had a knack of selling the same type of culture war red meat to the working class that Nixon did. As governor of California, he passed one of the first gun control laws in the United States, aimed at disarming the Black Panthers, who carried guns to protect black teenagers from being murdered by police. To the white working class, Reagan looked like someone who fearlessly stood up to assertive black people, the very people to whom they felt they were losing ground. And there was another dimension to his popularity. The rise of cable television had spawned the first generation of TV preachers, most of whom were associated with evangelical sectors of Christianity based in the South. The most famous of these preachers was Jerry Falwell, who hosted the Old Time Gospel Hour. He called for a return to traditional values before abortions, before women started working outside of the home, and before gay people had the freedom to come out publicly. He published newsletters that touched on all of these themes, allowing him to amass a database of hundreds of thousands of followers from whom he could solicit donations and, most importantly for Reagan, to whom he could make political endorsements. During the election of 1980, Jerry Falwell endorsed Ronald Reagan for president. As someone who believed in family values, it is ironic he endorsed Reagan over Carter. After all, Carter was a deeply religious Southerner who was faithfully married to one woman for decades. Meanwhile, Reagan was a twice-married Hollywood actor who never once indicated that religion was important to him in any way. But to the rising base of evangelical voters, it wasn't about who the candidates were. It was about what they were promising. Evangelical voters were from the white working class. They saw their jobs getting shipped overseas. They saw their guarantees of a middle-class life dashed. They saw their sons and daughters come out as gay. They saw their wives divorcing them or being forced to work outside of the home to make ends meet. They saw black people get hired for positions of leadership they could never hope to achieve. The world they had known, the world of the white male breadwinner with a stay-at-home wife and 2 or 3 obedient children, was dead. And what had replaced it? Rock and roll music, drugs, inner-city crime, pornography? Ronald Reagan stood against all that. He promised to cut taxes because, in their minds, taxes went to support lazy black people who didn't want to work. In reality, most of their tax money went to fighting the Cold War, or Social Security, or Medicare and Medicaid, or to maintain the roads they drove their cars on, or to farm subsidies that kept their food cheap, or oil subsidies that kept their gasoline cheap, most of the time. They were the biggest beneficiaries of taxes. They had benefited the most from Keynesianism, the system put into place by the Democratic Party under FDR. But Ronald Reagan told them a different story. Like Nixon, he painted the Democratic Party as the party of hippies, blacks, feminists, and gays. They wanted to use the hard-earned tax money of the middle class to fund what he called welfare queens in Chicago housing projects who didn't want to work. Elect him president, and he'll cut those taxes. He'll end those government regulations. The economy would pull out of stagflation. Jobs would be created. He would make America great again. Reagan's greatest accomplishment was marrying Nixon's politics of white working class grievance with the Business Roundtable's agenda of more goodies for the corporate classes. He brought these two groups together into an unholy union, one where the Business Roundtable's agenda promised to kill any hope for a middle-class life for the white working class. It wasn't corporations moving jobs overseas or busting unions that killed the middle class. It was the black civil rights leader that was killing them. Taxes didn't fund the social programs and infrastructure the middle class relied on. They funded welfare queens and abortions. Ronald Reagan's campaign advisor laid it all out in a now famous voice clip from the 1980s.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968 you can't say nigger, that hurts you, backfires, so you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously maybe that is part of it, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, you know. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.
The rise of Donald Trump in the 2010s is a replay of Nixon and Reagan. It is a continuation of the Republican agenda that was born with Nixon's victory in 1972.
And you're a joke candidate if you continue to raise questions about President Obama's citizenship.
There's a real question about the birth certificate. There's a real question about his own citizenship.
It is a symptom of a dying empire, of more Americans fighting for fewer resources. Those resources are fewer due to changes to the structure of the global economy. They are fewer due to the ravages of global warming, helped along by America's obsession with fossil fuels and the rollback of environmental protections. They are fewer because the corporate class has gobbled up more for itself while leaving the rest of us with scraps. It's fitting that Donald Trump presides over our death rattle, a man who literally got fat sucking the marrow out of the bones of American empire. As president, he will pump whatever is left into the coffers of the wealthiest people on board with his agenda. All the while, he will convince what was once the white working class, as represented by white evangelicals, that he is making America great again, that he is a crusader against Democrats who want to give the country over to blacks, women, gays, and now immigrants. What's sad about this isn't Trump's lies, his narcissism, his racism, or his transphobia. What's sad is that we should have seen this coming. What's sad is that he's working from a well-developed playbook written by Nixon and Reagan. And just like in the 1970s, Democrats have no answer. They have a roster full of Jimmy Carters and George McGoverns. The ones bold enough or smart enough to challenge Trump head-on are silenced and sidelined by their own party. The way the Humphrey Hawkins bill was sidelined by Carter. We can't blame Trump. We have to blame an entire rotten system that allows Trump to operate and a nation of selfish people who can't see through his lies. Lies that have been around for over 50 years since the start of the 1970s.